From a very young age, I have always been fascinated by simple shapes.
I do recall, in my childhood, playing with toys that sort of look like these ones here. In fact, I'm pretty certain that everybody at some stage in their childhood has played with toys that look like these or given them to your children in the hope that these toys enhance brain development. But at the end of the day, these toys just get sucked on despite having no nutritional value. I also recall at the age of 15 excelling at geometry in the mathematics class. But when it came to everything else mathematics, I went from top of the class right down to the very bottom. And this was of concern to the teacher, who took me out of the classroom and into his office, and he asked me if I had problems at home. But here's the thing, not everybody's brain is geared the same way. I've never been any good at mental arithmetic. I was never destined to become an accountant, and I have never held the desire to become a chief financial officer. On the other hand, I used to wonder why not everybody knows what the chord of a circle is. I've always known since I was first taught it at school, and I have never forgotten. You see, what I really enjoy is playing around with simple shapes. In this case, the circle, the triangle, the square, and the pentagon. So much so that these shapes became the focus of my thesis late last century. I'm showing my age already. And by the way, if anybody here suffers from insomnia, copies of my thesis are available at the back of the room. So one of the reasons why I like these shapes is because they can become complex very quickly. And by complex, I don't mean difficult. What I do mean is beautifully ordered at a detailed level. And in particular, I like to play around with these ratios because these ratios are embedded in these shapes. So one is the square root of 3, or the root 3 ratio. The other is the square root of 2, or the root 2 ratio. And the third one, some of you may have heard of, is the golden ratio. So in this presentation, I'm just going to go back here. So in this presentation, we are going to meander through a range of patterns and designs, and all of these patterns and designs will have something in common, and that is an underlying geometry that brings harmony to the design, irrespective of whether that design is simple or complex. But before we do that, I very quickly want to just go through a very tiny exercise with you. I want you to have a look at what's on the screen here. So we've got a little blue square, nothing particularly exciting, so I'll throw in another shape, a yellow torus, or donut, or you can call it a bagel. And I'll throw a few other shapes in there just for good measure. But I don't actually want you to look at these shapes. What I would like you to look at is the space in between, because the space in between is far more interesting. And this is where I like to spend a lot of my time, because I like to use this space to determine the size and location of all of the elements in a design. Now, the grid that you see in the background here is made up of pentagons and circles drawn within pentagons and circles. And the reason why I like working with grids like this is they introduce a sense of asymmetry to a design. So we've got symmetry and asymmetry built into the same background here. And this is another grid. So this is a grid with which I'm sure everybody here is familiar with. It's a grid of equidistant lines. And compared to the previous grid, this is actually quite boring because it just throws up the same shape over and over again, which is basically squares. Compare that to the grid on the right. Now this grid is far more interesting because it's also made up of squares, but they're squares drawn within circles, within squares drawn within circles. And I like working with grids like this because, again, they introduce asymmetry and complexity into a design. So here is the finished design on a canvas, and it was created purely for this presentation. It doesn't exactly exist in reality, so this is really a 3D version of the canvas. So you could call it a deep fake after watching that video, if you like. But the idea here is really just to demonstrate that geometry can be used to establish the size and location of all of the elements in a design. So let's have a look at something which has more of an historical context. Here we have an Islamic Star pattern. Now this pattern didn't just spring into existence out of nowhere, it is what the original designer wants us to see. But what is missing is the underlying geometry, the geometrical construction that had to exist first before this pattern came into existence. And so let's just have a look at what's in the background. And we see the very same grid that we saw earlier. Now this isn't necessarily the grid that the designer used originally, but it does correlate perfectly with this design. And I'd like to just touch on a few more things here, and that is this design exhibits a degree of complexity, as well as that asymmetrical arrangement of space. If you look at the spaces within that design from the outside in, they all vary in size and shape, but they all exist in harmony. And this particular design has some very simple origins. So starting with a simple shape like this, all we are doing is rotating that design. And the design also has 10 planes of reflection. And for most people, that's about all they see. A lot of people don't actually see the asymmetry within this pattern. And it is asymmetry that we see around us every day if we have a look in the natural world. It is asymmetry that sort of brings a sense of movement or growth to a design, as in natural growth. So over history, there's been a number of architectural styles that have come and gone, and at their height, geometry seems to have always played a big part in those particular architectural styles. So I'd like to just move on to another example. But before I do that, I want to also briefly just talk about asymmetry again, because that does not spring out of a grid of equidistant lines or squares. And when we look at a pattern like this, we can start to see that geometry can be used to incorporate simplicity, complexity, symmetry, and asymmetry into one particular design. So here is that other architectural period I was going to talk about, and what we have here is an example of a Gothic Trefoil window. It's not as geometric as the Islamic pattern we saw earlier, but geometry still played an important part in the construction of this window. So I've got a little bit of the geometry there. I haven't put all of it in there. But the point I wanted to make is geometry is also used to determine the size and location of all of the spaces in this design. So those are the spaces within which the glass will fit. So just coming forward in time again to the arts and crafts movement. And we have something here which is obviously not geometric, or at least apparently not geometric. So this is a variation of a William Morris design. And I put this variation together just to illustrate how geometry can be used to determine the size and location of every leaf, every berry, every fruit, every flower, including the curvature of every branch. Now I'd like to just come back to this design, or I guess more importantly to the grid that we see behind it. So this is that grid of pentagons drawn within circles within pentagons. And the reason for this is it segues nicely into the golden ratio, because the golden ratio just can be found within this particular grid 1,000 times over. It's just everywhere. But just to demonstrate what I'd like to do is just pull out an element in this grid. So I don't know whether you can see the stars in the centre there. This will make it a little bit more obvious. And here we have a typical 5-pointed star. So it's the star we see on flags all around the world, including the New Zealand flag. And I just wanted to show the relationship and how you can find the golden ratio in this 5-pointed star. So here we go. Length A divided by length B divided by length C, and length C divided by length D equals the golden ratio. And you're probably thinking, big deal. I mean, how does this apply to the real world around us? Well, I thought I'd take a picture of a flower just to illustrate this. And so what we've got here is a daisy. I just took this at random, picked it from the garden, took a photograph. And we can start to see that it correlates well with the circles from that grid, which are all related using the golden ratio. So if we have a quick look at this, radius A divided by radius B and radius B divided by radius C equals the golden ratio. So it's starting to see that the golden ratio correlates well with what we can see in the natural world. And I'd like to show you more examples, but we don't have enough time here. But that's not all, because you'll also find the golden ratio in your pocket if you have an iPhone. And you'll find it there many times over, along with those other ratios that I mentioned earlier. So I'm not a party to any of Apple's design secrets. It's just that when I see a design and I think the golden ratio is in there, I like to just check it out. So here we have that grid again, and just showing you where the golden ratio can be found. And what we're doing here is just drawing 3 circles. We're going to duplicate one of them and make it orange. So we've used the grid to determine the size of these circles, and now we're going to use the grid to determine the location of these circles. And what you end up with is an exact match for the weather icon on your iPhone. And Apple's use of the golden ratio is really no secret, because in 2013 Apple released this grid for the world. And you may have actually seen it on your iPhone as well, because if an icon doesn't display correctly, you see this instead. And within this icon grid, we also find the golden ratio, a nice asymmetric arrangement of space. And here we go again. A divided by B, B divided by C, D divided by E equals the golden ratio. Now, there's something missing from here, because we also have another ratio, and that is the square root of 2. And again, this is one of those big deal moments. I mean, who comes across this ratio every day? Well, actually, all of you do. In your business lives, you handle this ratio in the form of a rectangle every single day at work. And what is it? It's that piece of paper that you put through the photocopier. And what you'll find is if you look at the length and you divide it by the width of the paper, it equals the square root of 2. And this particular rectangle is unique in the entire universe. It's the only rectangle that you can fold in half, and in half again, and you can go on forever, and each of those little rectangles has the same proportions as the parent. That is, the length divided by the width equals the square root of 2, and that's why it's such a handy piece of paper. So we're beginning to see that the golden ratio, and also the other ratios I mentioned earlier, correlate pretty well with what we see in the natural world, and also in some of the products that we buy. But here is the caveat. Nothing in this world is perfectly straight. Nothing in this world is perfectly round. It's always just a little bit on the lumpy side. People's faces are not perfectly bilaterally symmetrical, even the handsome ones like this guy here. And starfish are not perfectly radially symmetrical. And when it comes to the world, or the natural world, or the world around us that has been designed for us, the golden rectangle does not correlate exactly with anything. And the reason is it doesn't have to, because we live in a perfectly imperfect world, where the perfection we seek really only exists in our imagination. And it's this perfectly imperfect world that gives rise to the regular patterns that we recognize, the characteristically regular patterns that we recognize, and although these cells in this honeycomb all look the same, they all vary in size just a fraction. The walls of those cells vary in thickness just a fraction. It's all just perfectly imperfect. And this perfectly imperfect world also gives rise to the characteristically irregular shapes that we see every day. And I can pretty much guarantee that nobody in this room has ever seen this cloud before. And you will never ever see it again, because the molecules of water in this cloud will never arrange themselves in exactly the same way ever again. And in fact, since about two or 3 weeks ago, since I took this photo, the molecules of this cloud have probably dispersed themselves halfway around the planet. And yet, when we see a cloud, we recognize this characteristic irregularity and we immediately know what it is. So we're starting to wrap up here now. So probably the best way to describe my entire thesis, if you could put it that way, is when we look at natural forms, we can establish a correlation between what we see and geometry. We can use these correlations to discern some design principles, which we can then apply to the world that we design. So from the study of a few simple shapes, we can begin to incorporate symmetry, asymmetry, simplicity, and complexity into the products that we design. I am a space explorer, and I would like to invite all of you here to begin exploring the space in between the things that you see. Thank you.